By 1777, the American Revolution in the East was fought with conventional armies, but on the western frontier, it was a war of survival and paid bounties to Native American warriors to raid isolated American settlements. The colonial response was purely defensive. Settlers abandoned and huddled inside crude wooden stockades, trying to outlast a brutal war of attrition. A 24-year-old land surveyor named George Rogers Clark saw a fatal flaw in this strategy. He realized that hiding behind wooden walls guaranteed the frontier's eventual collapse. Clark proposed abandoning local defense entirely. He wanted to cross hundreds of miles of unmapped wilderness, bypass the raiding parties, and capture the British supply forts directly. He took the idea to Virginia Governor Patrick Henry, who secretly approved the operation. But the resources were incredibly thin. Clark was authorized to raise a meager force of only 175 volunteers for an expedition deep into enemy territory. This was a complete inversion of military logic. Rather than trying to match British resources across a vast defensive line, Clark bet that a highly mobile, deep strike maneuver could cut the enemy off at the source. The campaign started remarkably well. Clark marched his small force to the Mississippi River and captured the British post at Kaskaskia without firing a shot, entirely by convincing the local French civilians to swear allegiance to the American cause. The British response was immediate. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton marched south from Detroit with 600 men, easily recaptured Fort Sackville at Vincennes, and prepared to crush Clark's tiny militia. But Hamilton stopped at Vincennes. Winter had set in, and heavy rains had flooded the plains, turning the fort into a virtual island surrounded by miles of freezing water. Hamilton decided to wait for spring, assuming the terrain was impassable. That assumption relied heavily on standard military doctrine. Hamilton trusted the flooded rivers to act as a natural wall, completely unaware that his enemy was preparing to use those exact waters against him. While Hamilton kept his men warm inside Fort Sackville, Clark made a desperate gamble. In February 1779, he ordered his 170 men out of their winter quarters and directly into the flooded plains. They called it the Drowned Country. For 2 weeks, the men marched almost 200 miles through continuous freezing rain, wading through standing water that covered the flat landscape in every direction. The breaking point arrived at the Little Wabash River. It had overflowed its banks, creating a freezing lake 5 miles wide. Right as they reached the water's edge, their food supply ran out entirely. By the final approach to Vincennes, the expedition ground to a halt. The men were starving, soaked to the bone, and freezing. They collapsed onto a small patch of muddy high ground and refused to move any further. Clark didn't offer a speech about duty. He scooped up wet black gunpowder, smeared it across his face like war paint, and plunged straight into the chest-high ice water. The sheer force of that action pulled the men forward. Surviving the Drowned Country meant stripping away traditional logistics and running entirely on the psychological momentum of frontline leadership. When the exhausted, half-drowned Americans finally reached the outskirts of Vincennes, they faced a heavily fortified British garrison equipped with cannons. Clark's men had no heavy artillery and were vastly outnumbered. To survive the assault, Clark had to mask his severe numerical disadvantage using psychological warfare. He ordered his men to unfurl dozens of different company flags. He then marched his small force in a continuous loop behind a series of small hills, creating the illusion of a massive, endless column of arriving reinforcements. While the British scrambled to prepare for a huge army, Clark's frontier riflemen crept into the surrounding town. Using extreme precision, they shot directly through the fort's wooden gun ports, preventing the British artillerymen from ever firing their cannons. Hamilton was trapped, stunned by the relentless accuracy of the rifle fire and terrified of the phantom army outside his walls. He unconditionally surrendered Fort Sackville on February 25th. Clark took the fort without losing a single soldier. Clark defeated a fortified position not by fielding superior firepower, but by projecting an illusion of overwhelming force that shattered the British commander's will to fight. The surrender at Vincennes permanently broke the British grip on the Illinois country. Take a close look at this document. These are the signatures and red wax seals on the 1783 Treaty of Paris. When British diplomats negotiated the end of the Revolutionary War, Clark's physical military occupation forced them to formally concede the western frontier. This 18th-century map illustrates the true scale of that concession. The red shaded border highlights the acquisition of the entire Northwest Territory, land that would eventually become modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But the United States government refused to honor the cost of that victory. Clark had borrowed heavily on his own name to keep his men fed and armed during the campaign, and Virginia passed his enormous debts from committee to committee without ever fully reimbursing him. Creditors systematically stripped Clark of his property. He suffered a debilitating stroke, lost his right leg to burn injuries from a fireplace accident, and spent his final years living in obscurity. The young nation abandoned the commander who secured its vast expansion. Yet his campaign proves that history is shaped by those willing to abandon safety, outthink their enemy, and step into the freezing unknown first. Most histories of the American Revolution focus almost exclusively on the original 13 colonies. We recognize George Washington's Continental Army, the debates in Philadelphia, and the battles fought along the Atlantic coast. But as this 1783 map shows, the young United States also claimed a massive region to the west, labeled the Northwest Territory. This land, spanning what is now Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, was not won by the famous generals of the East. Instead, the American claim to this wilderness rested on the shoulders of roughly 170 starving volunteers. They were led by a 25-year-old surveyor from Virginia named George Rogers Clark, who marched his men into flooded marshes that seasoned officers considered impassable. The story of how Clark secured this land, and the obscurity he faced afterward, reveals one of the most significant and overlooked personal tragedies of the Revolutionary era. By 1777, the western frontier was in a state of collapse. British commanders at Fort Detroit were supplying Native American war parties to raid American settlements in Kentucky. It was a period of such relentless violence that settlers remembered it simply as the Year of the Bloody Sevens. The standard response was purely defensive. Families abandoned their farms and huddled inside crude wooden stockades, hoping the next raid would pass them by. George Rogers Clark realized that as long as British forts supplied these attacks, the settlements would eventually be wiped out. Clark proposed a radical shift in strategy. Rather than waiting behind walls, he wanted to lead a secret offensive hundreds of miles into enemy territory to seize the British supply hubs in the Illinois country. Recruiting for such a high-risk mission was nearly impossible. Clark had authorized 350 men, but when he finally set off down the Ohio River, he had only 175 untrained volunteers, no heavy artillery, and no hope of reinforcement if the mission failed. By moving forward anyway, Clark transformed a desperate frontier defense into a seemingly suicidal invasion of the British interior. Clark's first target was Kaskaskia. Instead of a loud traditional siege, he moved his men through the woods in total silence, slipping into the village at night. They secured the streets and captured the local commander in his bed without firing a single shot. To maintain control, Clark turned to diplomacy. He informed the terrified French residents that the United States and France had signed an alliance. Fearing the Americans were barbarians, the residents were so relieved by Clark's promise of religious freedom that they immediately switched their allegiance away from Britain. The British responded quickly. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton recaptured the fort at Vincennes, but he assumed the winter weather protected him from any American counterattack. He settled in to wait for spring, separated from Clark by 180 miles of flooded wilderness. Hamilton relied on the freezing water as a defensive shield. Clark saw that same water as the only way to achieve a total surprise. In February 1779, Clark's men waded into a region they called the Drowned Country. For 2 weeks, they struggled through icy water that reached their waists and eventually their chests. Their food ran out, their clothes never dried, and one small drummer boy had to float on top of his drum to keep from drowning. As the men reached the point of collapse, Clark used psychology to push them forward. He smeared black powder across his face like war paint, and without saying a word, stepped into the freezing water first to lead the column. By the final miles, the men were pulling each other through chest-deep water, waking up on muddy mounds with their clothing frozen to their bodies. They were starving and exhausted, but they had reached the outskirts of Vincennes. Surviving the march only earned them a new crisis. They were now a tiny, starving force, standing outside the walls of a heavily fortified British garrison. Clark knew that a direct assault by 170 men against the fort's cannons would be a massacre. He needed the British to believe they were facing a massive continental army, not a handful of starving militiamen. He ordered his men to unfurl every flag they carried and march in a continuous loop behind a series of small hills. From the perspective of the fort, it appeared as though an endless column of fresh troops was surrounding the town. Clark then positioned his best marksmen behind houses and fences. They fired with such accuracy through the fort's gun ports that the British could not open them to return fire with their cannons without being struck. By breaking Hamilton's resolve through deception and sharpshooting, Clark forced an unconditional surrender. He captured one of Britain's most important Western strongholds without losing a single man. In the 1783 Treaty of Paris, signatures from John Adams and Benjamin Franklin carried immense weight. Because Clark's men physically occupied the Illinois country, American diplomats argued the United States already controlled the region. This forced Britain to cede the entire Northwest Territory. The impact was staggering. This diplomatic victory, built on Clark's winter march, effectively doubled the size of the original 13 colonies. With no federal funding and fewer than 200 men, Clark won a landmass stretching from the Ohio River to the Great Lakes. While the newly won frontier began to prosper, Clark himself was destroyed. He had personally financed the campaign, using his own money to buy food and supplies for his men. The government acknowledged the debt, but reimbursement payments came so slowly that Clark spent the rest of his life pursued by creditors. He lost his land and health. In his 50s, Clark suffered a severe stroke and a fireplace accident requiring his leg to be amputated. The man who had once marched hundreds of miles could no longer walk. When George Rogers Clark died in 1818, he was living with relatives in near obscurity. There were no national monuments to the man whose daring march had redefined the borders of the country. George Rogers Clark died in the shadow of a nation he had physically reshaped, his legacy forged in freezing floodwaters, by a commander who sacrificed his future for a country that never paid him back. In 1777, the American Revolution on the East Coast was an organized war of armies and generals, but across the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky, it was a slaughter. Settlers called it the Year of the Bloody Sevens. Isolated cabins were burned, families slept with loaded rifles, and anyone stepping outside risked an immediate ambush. The violence was actually being orchestrated from hundreds of miles away. Looking at this map of the frontier region, you can see British forts spotted north of the Ohio River. From these distant strongholds, British officers, safely insulated from the fighting, supplied weapons and paid bounties to Native American war parties to terrorize the isolated American settlements. The colonists' response was purely defensive. They hid inside crude wooden forts, hoping to outlast the attacks until winter. But you cannot win a war by waiting for the next raid. The violence was a symptom, and those wooden walls were slowly becoming tombs. A 25-year-old frontier surveyor named George Rogers Clark saw the fatal flaw in this strategy. He understood the terrain better than almost anyone, and he realized that as long as those British outposts remained untouched, the violence would never stop. He proposed an entirely different approach, a direct, offensive strike. He traveled to Virginia and convinced Governor Patrick Henry to secretly authorize a wildly ambitious plan. Clark wanted to take a force of around 170 untrained militiamen, bypass any reliable supply lines, and march hundreds of miles through untamed wilderness to capture the distant British forts directly. To save Kentucky, Clark decided to abandon the safety of the stockades, cross a massive expanse of hostile territory, and cut off the British war machine exactly at its source. The expedition began in the summer of 1778. Instead of taking predictable river routes, Clark led his men on a grueling 120-mile overland march through the dense Illinois wilderness to surprise the British outpost at Kaskaskia. They arrived under the cover of darkness and secured the town without firing a single shot. Most of the residents were French Catholics. By guaranteeing their religious freedom and casually mentioning the new military alliance between France and the United States, Clark flipped the loyalties of the entire local population overnight. British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton quickly moved to crush this incursion. He marched a force south and easily recaptured Fort Sackville at Vincennes, located to the east. But rather than pressing on to destroy Clark, Hamilton stopped. It was late in the year. Torrential rains had turned the Wabash River Valley into miles of icy mud, isolating Vincennes. Clark looked at that map, gathered his men, and plotted a path straight through the flooded marshland. If Hamilton thought an attack was physically impossible, he wouldn't post guards, he wouldn't prepare defenses. By choosing to march in the dead of February, Clark turned the brutal frontier weather into his primary weapon, planning to strike his enemy exactly when they felt the most secure. The march quickly deteriorated into a fight for survival. For over 2 weeks, Clark's men waded through an endless inland sea. Often the freezing water reached their waists. Sometimes it climbed chest-deep. Their horses couldn't navigate the floods. Their food supplies vanished entirely. At night, they slept on mud, clothes frozen to their bodies. Hunting was nearly impossible, leaving the men to hike 180 miles on empty stomachs. The breaking point arrived at the flooded Wabash River. The water had merged into a sprawling lake over 4 miles wide. Standing on the freezing banks, starving and shivering, the exhausted militia hesitated. For the first time, the men refused to move forward, believing they would drown before reaching the other side. Clark didn't bother with a grand speech. He reached into his pouch, he smeared black gunpowder across his face, let out a war cry, and silently stepped into the icy water first. Watching their commander push through the surface ice with his bare hands, the men found the courage to follow. They finally reached dry ground on the outskirts of Vincennes. Knowing he was severely outgunned, Clark used the terrain to project false strength. He unfurled dozens of company flags and marched his 170 exhausted men in continuous loops behind a series of small hills, creating the illusion of a massive 600-man army surrounding the town. Looking at the firing mechanism on this frontier long rifle, you can see the precise tool the Americans utilized to terrifying effect. Frontier hunters who were used to hitting small game at long distances aimed directly at the narrow defensive gun ports. Every time a British artilleryman opened a port to light a cannon, a rifle ball found him first. Trapped, unable to fire his artillery, and believing he was vastly outnumbered, Henry Hamilton walked out of the fort the next morning and unconditionally surrendered his garrison to a band of starving, half-drowned militiamen. Clark secured the victory not by bringing more troops or heavier cannons, but by enduring unimaginable physical suffering to completely break the psychological will of the British command. The consequences of that frozen march stretched far beyond the Wabash River. We can see its impact clearly on this document, the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. During peace negotiations, diplomats operate on a strict legal reality. You cannot claim territory at the table if your military does not physically occupy it on the ground. By holding the Illinois country, diplomats gained immense leverage. This historical map's massive pink section, labeled Northwest Territory 1783, reveals the exact land Britain conceded. Comparing this to the original eastern seaboard clearly shows Clark's campaign doubled the nation's size. Yet the nation he helped build quickly turned its back on him. Virginia refused to reimburse Clark for the massive personal debts he took on to keep his men fed and armed. His property was seized by creditors, and he died in relative obscurity, spending his final years as an amputee, suffering from severe strokes. History frequently overlooks the individuals who suffer the worst hardships to draw our maps. By refusing to let the frontier defeat him, George Rogers Clark weaponized the wilderness itself, carving out an empire that allowed the United States to expand across the continent. It is 1777. Washington's Continental Army is trading blows with the British along the eastern seaboard. But hundreds of miles away, across the Appalachian Mountains, a different kind of war is bleeding the Kentucky frontier dry. Settlers call it the Year of the Bloody Sevens. The violence is heavily subsidized. From fortified outposts in the Illinois country, British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton coordinates and supplies Native American war parties. He pays bounties for American scalps and prisoners, outsourcing the destruction of isolated pioneer settlements. The American response is reactive. Terrified families abandon their farms and huddle inside crude wooden stockades. They sleep with loaded rifles beside their beds, hoping they have provisions to survive the season. Playing defense against a well-funded empire is a losing strategy. When the enemy controls the supply lines and dictates the timing of every raid, hiding behind wooden walls only delays an inevitable collapse. Looking at this portrait of George Rogers Clark in his military dress, you might not immediately see the architect of an empire. He is only 25 years old here. A land surveyor with a limited formal education, Clark realized as long as the British held those western forts, the raids would never stop. He proposed marching hundreds of miles into the wilderness to take the fight directly to the British source. Clark traveled back east and pitched this counteroffensive to Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry. Henry secretly approved the mission but provided very little to execute it. By the time Clark launched his campaign, he had scraped together exactly 170 men. They had no standard uniforms, limited supplies, and zero artillery. The plan was high risk. This tiny, under-equipped militia was marching blindly into the frontier to challenge the British hold on a landmass that would eventually form 5 American states. This historical map of the Illinois country shows the position of Kaskaskia along the river. Clark knew a river approach would be spotted, so he forced his men on a 120-mile overland march through the sweltering summer woods. On the night of July 4th, 1778, they slipped into the village under the cover of darkness. They secured the streets and captured the British commander in his bed, without firing a single shot. The French-speaking population expected the American frontiersmen to be violent. Instead, Clark gathered the villagers and announced that France and the United States had signed a formal alliance. The news changed the atmosphere in the room instantly. Having no deep loyalty to Britain, the French residents immediately swore allegiance to the American cause. This flip provided Clark's men with critical intelligence on British troop movements, fresh food, and local volunteers who helped secure the neighboring outposts of Cahokia and Vincennes within weeks. Clark understood that military control was impossible without local cooperation. By establishing trust with the French inhabitants, he transformed a hostile territory into a logistical support network that allowed his small force to operate deep behind enemy lines. The British response arrived that winter. Henry Hamilton marched south and recaptured Fort Sackville at Vincennes. But then Hamilton made a calculation that would lead to his defeat. He assumed the torrential rains and flooded plains of the Wabash River Basin made a winter counterattack impossible. He sent most of his allies home and settled in to wait for spring. Clark saw Hamilton's sense of security as an opening. If the British commander believed the freezing environment made the fort unreachable, that was the exact moment the Americans had to arrive. In February 1779, Clark led 170 men into the flooded plains. For nearly 3 weeks, they waded through miles of freezing water that reached their knees, then their waists, and eventually their chests. They had no dry clothes, very little food, and slept on whatever patches of high ground they could find in the drowned country. Near the end of the march, the men reached a flooded plain 4 miles wide. Many believed they would die there. Rather than giving a speech, Clark smeared wet gunpowder across his face and stepped into the ice water first. His men watched him break through the surface ice with his fists, and one by one they followed his lead. By choosing a season that the British military considered impassable, Clark removed the environment as a defensive factor. He converted the freezing winter flood into his own tactical concealment. When this column finally arrived outside Vincennes, they were starving and entirely lacked the artillery required for a traditional siege. If Hamilton realized how small and exhausted the American force actually was, he could have easily marched out and overwhelmed them. To prevent this, Clark created a visual deception. He ordered his men to march in continuous loops behind small hills on the edge of town, unfurling dozens of makeshift flags. By appearing and reappearing from different directions, he tricked the British into believing a massive army had surrounded the fort. This frontier flintlock was the tool that finished vivisection. Clark's men were elite marksmen. They took positions behind houses and trees, firing with such accuracy into the fort's gun ports that the British could not open them to return fire with their own cannons. Pinned down and convinced he was facing hundreds of fresh troops, Henry Hamilton surrendered Fort Sackville on February 25th. Clark had captured the most important British stronghold in the West without losing a single man in the assault. This is the final page of the 1783 Treaty of Paris, featuring the wax seals and signatures of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. When these men negotiated the end of the Revolutionary War, they held a powerful argument. They didn't just want the Western Territory, they physically occupied it. This map of the United States after 1783 reveals the impact of Clark's campaign. By holding the outposts at Kaskaskia and Vincennes, he secured the American claim to the entire Northwest Territory, effectively doubling the size of the original 13 colonies. Diplomacy can claim a border on paper, but those claims only hold weight when someone has demonstrated the willingness to defend that land in person. But the conquest left George Rogers Clark personally ruined. To feed and clothe his men, he had borrowed enormous sums of money that the government failed to reimburse for decades. His property was seized by creditors, and he spent much of his later life in poverty. His physical decline was equally grim. After suffering a series of debilitating strokes, Clark was severely burned in a fireplace accident that led to the amputation of his leg. As the young United States grew wealthy and expanded across the very territory he had secured, the man responsible for it lived in near obscurity with relatives until his death at age 65. George Rogers Clark's life ended in a modest cabin, but the border he established remained. His decision to step into the freezing water first shaped the map of a growing nation, long after the empire he helped build had moved on without him. February 1779. Deep in the Illinois wilderness, a column of 170 militiamen is wading through miles of chest-high, freezing water. They haven't eaten in 2 days. Their clothes are soaked through to the skin, and every step requires breaking through fresh sheets of surface ice. The man leading them is a 26-year-old surveyor from Virginia. Instead of calling a retreat, he smears black powder gun across his face, lets out a war cry, and plunges back into the freezing current first. This starving, half-drowned column is not retreating. They are actively marching toward Fort Sackville, a heavily defended stronghold controlling the western edge of the British Empire. This march functioned as a calculated strike, the culmination of a broader asymmetrical strategy to break the British hold on the West. To understand why these men are in that swamp, we have to look back 2 years to 1777, shown here on this historical map of the Kentucky Territory. Settlers called this period the Year of the Bloody Sevens because isolated American farming communities along these sprawling river systems were living in a constant state of terror. British Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, commanding from Detroit, was waging a proxy war. He supplied Native American war parties and paid bounties for American scalps and prisoners, earning him the grim nickname the Hair Buyer across the frontier. While George Washington fought the main British army along the eastern seaboard, Western settlers believed their only option was to hide behind crude wooden stockades and pray they survived another season. George Rogers Clark, a young frontiersman who knew the terrain, realized defending these isolated settlements would inevitably fail. He rode east to Virginia and told Governor Patrick Henry that the only way to stop the raids was a deep strike offensive hundreds of miles into the wilderness to cut off the British supply chain at its source. Clark asked to take a tiny force into uncharted territory with no supply lines and no chance of rescue. He walked out of that meeting with secret authorization to try. This chart compares the troops Clark requested against what he actually got. Competing with the Continental Army for recruits, he secured barely 175 volunteers. They had 0 heavy wagons, 0 uniforms, and absolutely no artillery. Knowing the British monitored the main river routes to Kaskaskia, Clark landed early, marching 120 miles overland through trackless Illinois in sweltering summer. Arriving on July 4, 1778, they split into small groups, secured the streets, and captured the British commander without firing a single shot. The town's French Catholic residents expected violent retribution from the Americans. Instead, Clark guaranteed their religious freedom and informed them that France had just signed a formal alliance with the United States. The locals instantly pledged allegiance to Virginia, providing Clark with crucial intelligence and supplies. He had taken the town and converted the population into a logistical support system, but his victory placed a massive target on his back. When word reached Detroit, Lieutenant Governor Hamilton marched south with roughly 600 men. He easily reclaimed the nearby settlement of Vincennes and occupied Fort Sackville. Hamilton assessed the freezing, flooded landscape and concluded that military operations were impossible until spring. Confident that nature itself provided a perfect defense, he sent his Native American allies home for the winter and settled in to wait. Clark knew that if he waited for Hamilton to launch a full-scale spring offensive, his 175 men would be wiped out. The brutal winter conditions Hamilton viewed as a barrier were actually Clark's only chance to catch the British off guard. He mobilized his men for a 180-mile march toward Vincennes through an area he called the Drowned Country. Heavy rains had caused the Wabash River to overflow, turning the plains into a massive, freezing marsh several miles wide. This was the ultimate double-or-nothing wager. If the starvation and hypothermia of the march didn't kill them, a well-rested, fortified army was waiting at the end. Reaching the outskirts of Vincennes undetected, Clark ordered his men to unfurl every flag they carried. He paraded his exhausted troops in continuous loops behind a series of small hills, creating the optical illusion of an endless reinforcement column for the townspeople. When night fell, his frontier marksmen crept through the village, using local houses and wooden fences as cover, to close in on Fort Sackville and pin down the British cannons. These Kentucky hunters were capable of putting a rifle ball through a target the size of a keyhole at 100 yards. They laid down fire with such lethal accuracy into the fort's narrow gun ports that the British soldiers couldn't even open them to shoot back. Stunned by the ferocious assault and cut off from any hope of rescue, Hamilton walked out on the morning of February 25th and unconditionally surrendered. The starving militia had forced the surrender of an imperial stronghold using only speed, deception, and the sheer accuracy of their sharpshooting. The impact of that morning extended far beyond the frontier. This is the 1783 Treaty of Paris, the formal document ending the war, where Great Britain officially ceded the entire Northwest Territory to the United States. The American diplomats at the negotiating table had leverage for one specific reason. George Rogers Clark physically occupied the territory and maintained military control over its key forts. By refusing to play defense, a 26-year-old surveyor doubled the physical size of the new republic. But Clark did not get to share in the prosperity he secured. To keep his men fed and armed during the campaign, he borrowed heavily from friends and spent his own money, racking up enormous personal debt. When the war ended, the state of Virginia and the federal government refused to reimburse him, passing his ledgers from committee to committee for decades, while creditors systematically dismantled his life. Stripped of his land, Clark's later years were marked by severe strokes and an accidental fall into a fireplace that forced the amputation of his leg. He lived out his final days relying on family members for basic care. Ultimately, George Rogers Clark wagered his life and his fortune to secure the future of the United States. The nation kept the territory and left the man who won it to die in obscurity. It is February 1779. Deep in the Illinois wilderness, 170 starving men are wading through miles of chest-deep, freezing floodwaters. They haven't had a proper meal in days. The man leading them is a 26-year-old from Virginia named George Rogers Clark. The miserable, freezing march he is leading right now will ultimately double the size of the United States. This desperate march through the wilderness is the climax of a high-stakes gamble to save the American frontier. To understand why Clark is standing in an icy swamp, we have to look back to 1777. While George Washington fights the British in the East, The western frontier is enduring a slaughter the settlers call the Year of the Bloody Sevens. British commanders stationed in Detroit, specifically Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, are funding devastating Native American raids. They supply weapons from heavily fortified western outposts to attack isolated American settlements. Most settlers respond by hiding behind crude wooden stockades, hoping to survive the season. Clark sees that pure defense is a delayed death sentence. The raids will never stop as long as the British forts supply them. He proposes marching a small, unfunded militia hundreds of miles into enemy territory to cut off those supply lines at their source. Clark's strategy forces a choice between certain, slow annihilation at home or a fast, high-stakes offensive in the wilderness. Clark secures secret approval from Virginia Governor Patrick Henry. Out on the frontier, recruiting is difficult. He manages to raise barely 175 untrained men, half the force he deemed necessary. Rather than taking the expected, heavily patrolled river routes, Clark leads his men overland through the trackless summer wilderness. On July 4, 1778, they slip into the British outpost at Kaskaskia under the cover of darkness, securing the town without firing a single shot. The town is mostly populated by French Catholics who expect the arriving Americans to act as hostile conquerors. Instead, Clark guarantees their safety, protects their property, and promises total religious freedom. Taking a fort requires weapons. Holding hostile territory requires local trust. Clark secures that resource through unexpected generosity, turning fearful residents into active supporters. The British strike back. In December 1778, Henry Hamilton marches south and easily recaptures Fort Sackville at the settlement of Vincennes. Feeling secure, Hamilton sends his Native American allies home and settles in to wait for spring. Hamilton assumes he is safe because of the harsh Illinois winter. Continuous rain has caused the rivers to overflow, turning the plains around Vincennes into a frozen, flooded marsh known as the Drowned Country. Clark knows that waiting for spring means Hamilton will rebuild his army and crush the Americans. He decides to use the brutal weather to his advantage, launching an attack exactly when his enemy believes it is impossible. Clark and his volunteers endure a grueling 180-mile march through freezing floodwaters. Provisions run out. At the deepest crossings, a young drummer boy has to float on his instrument just to keep from drowning. To keep panic from spreading, Clark darkens his face with gunpowder and plunges into the icy water first. He leads from the front, setting a pace his exhausted men feel compelled to follow. Before Clark could defeat the British military, he first had to defeat the despair and physical limitations of his own men. When they finally arrive outside Vincennes, Clark's 170 men are exhausted, starving, and lack the heavy artillery needed to survive a traditional siege against Fort Sackville's walls. Clark relies on theatrical deception. He orders his small force to unfurl every flag they have and march in a continuous loop behind a series of small hills on the edge of town, creating the optical illusion of a massive, overwhelming army. Meanwhile, his frontier sharpshooters take positions behind fences and buildings. Unlike soldiers trained in mass volleys, these men fire with individualized accuracy, shooting directly through the fort's own defensive gun ports whenever a British soldier exposes himself. Surrounded by invisible marksmen and convinced he faced a massive American force, Hamilton requested a truce. Despite his fortified position, the British commander surrendered the garrison to a force that hadn't lost a single man in the attack. By physically occupying these western forts and forging treaties with the local Native American tribes, Clark secured a monumental advantage. This document is the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783 to officially end the war. Clark's physical control of the frontier provided American diplomats with the crucial leverage they needed during these negotiations. Looking at this map of the United States in 1783, you can see the scale of the victory. Britain ceded the entire Northwest Territory, a massive region between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes that became states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Without Clark's physical presence in the West, the young United States likely ends at the Appalachian Mountains, ceding the heart of the continent to the British Empire. The cost of this victory fell squarely on Clark himself. He personally financed the expedition, borrowing heavily from friends to keep his men fed and armed. The state of Virginia and the newly formed U.S. government abandoned him. They buried his reimbursement claims in committees for years, leaving creditors to seize his personal property. Clark rapidly declined into poverty. After suffering a severe stroke and a burn that cost him his leg, he spent his final years bedridden, dying in debt and obscurity. The expanded map of the United States was secured by a 26-year-old who risked his life and fortune, only to be left in poverty by the nation he helped build. It is February 1779. Deep in the Illinois wilderness, a column of 170 starving men is wading through freezing water that reaches their chests. Their clothes are soaked. Their food ran out 2 days ago. Many of them can barely lift their legs to take another step. At the front of this desperate line stands a 26-year-old commander. Realizing his men are at their breaking point, he doesn't give a speech. Instead, he smears black gunpowder across his face like war paint, lets out a yell, and plunges into the icy water first. The men follow him, but their destination offers little comfort. They are marching toward a heavily armed British fort. They have no artillery, no supply lines, and zero chance of reinforcements. This half-drowned column of militia was executing a calculated campaign of asymmetrical warfare. To see why they were in this swamp, we have to look back to 1777. While General George Washington fought conventional battles along the eastern seaboard, the western frontier was experiencing a brutal reality that settlers called the Year of the Bloody Sevens. This map shows the western boundary of the colonies, with the vast frontier territory stretching behind the Appalachian Mountains. British commanders used a network of forts scattered across this expanse to supply weapons and coordinate Native American raids against American settlements. The strategy paralyzed the frontier. Settlers abandoned their farms and moved inside crude wooden stockades to play defense, hoping to survive the next attack. A young land surveyor named George Rogers Clark saw a flaw in this defensive mindset. He realized that hiding behind wooden walls would never stop the violence as long as the British forts remained operational. Clark traveled to Virginia and presented the governor, Patrick Henry, with a proposal. He asked to lead a small force hundreds of miles deep into enemy territory, capture the forts one by one, and sever the supply chains at their source. The governor agreed in secret, but the recruitment was difficult. Clark requested 350 men. He received barely half that number, no cannons, and no supply chain to keep his troops fed. With 175 men, capturing a territory the size of an empire required Clark to discard the traditional military playbook. His first tactic relied on speed and secrecy over logistics. In July 1778, rather than taking the expected, heavily watched river routes, Clark ordered his men to march 120 miles overland through trackless wilderness. The hike paid off. His force arrived at the British outpost of Kaskaskia undetected in the middle of the night. They secured the town and the fort without firing a single shot. Capturing Kaskaskia created a new problem. Clark's tiny force could not hold a hostile French Catholic town through long-term military occupation. Instead of using brute force, Clark used a psychological maneuver. He let the townspeople stew in fear of the American militia overnight. Then he gathered them together, announced that France and the United States were formal allies, and guaranteed their absolute freedom of religion. The relief was immediate. By flipping the civilian population's allegiance, Clark solved his logistical problem. The once hostile locals became a source of intelligence, food, and volunteer soldiers. The British quickly responded. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton marched a force of 600 men south and recaptured Fort Sackville at Vincennes. Confident in his position, Hamilton decided to wait for spring to attack Clark, assuming winter travel was impossible. Waiting for spring meant defeat. Clark gambled on a 200-mile winter march through flooded country. Reaching Vincennes starving and exhausted, he orchestrated a theatrical deception to overcome the British numbers. He ordered his men to unfurl flags and march in continuous loops behind small hills. By appearing, disappearing, and reappearing, this small, exhausted band convinced the townspeople and the British garrison that a fresh army of 600 men had just arrived. Panic set in, and no one raised the alarm. For the final tactical strike, Clark utilized his elite frontier marksmen. These riflemen fired with such accuracy right through the fort's gun ports that the British soldiers could not open them to operate their cannons. The accuracy, combined with the illusion of numbers and the shock of a winter attack, broke the British resolve. The fortified commander was forced to unconditionally surrender. Clark's victory provided geopolitical leverage. Because his troops physically occupied these key forts, American diplomats had a much stronger hand when negotiating the end of the war. This original document of the 1783 Treaty of Paris shows the formal result of that leverage. Britain officially ceded the entire Northwest Territory to the United States. This land acquisition doubled the size of the original 13 colonies, creating what we now know as Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Yet the man who secured this expanse was left ruined. To keep his men armed and fed during the campaign, Clark had personally borrowed heavily. The new nation he helped expand refused to reimburse him. The rest of his life was a slow decline. Hounded by creditors, Clark lost his land. He suffered a stroke, burned his leg so badly it required amputation, and died in obscurity at the age of 65. The modern map of the United States was drawn in part by politicians in Paris, but the borders were forged by a desperate tactician who gave everything he had to a country that never paid him back. In February 1779, deep in the Illinois wilderness, 170 starving men stared out at a frozen, flooded plain. Their clothes were soaked, their food ran out days ago, and most were ready to quit. Their 26-year-old commander didn't offer a rousing speech. He simply smeared black gunpowder across his face, let out a war cry, and stepped into the freezing water first. That brutal, seemingly suicidal march was the gamble that would decide the fate of the American frontier. The man leading it was George Rogers Clark. Clark grew up on the Virginia frontier with almost no formal schooling. Instead, he mastered mathematics and wilderness navigation by working as a land surveyor, mapping the edges of European settlement. By his 20s, he was entrenched in Kentucky, where the Revolutionary War took on horrifying scale. British officers operating out of Detroit actively paid Native American war parties bounties for American scalps. Most settlers responded to the violence by retreating. They built heavy wooden stockades, played defense, and prayed their families would survive the next raid. Clark realized the logic of the frontier war was broken. As long as British forts supplied the attackers, staying behind walls was a slow way to lose. To survive, the settlers had to strike the source. Virginia authorized Clark to take the offensive, but they gave him almost nothing to work with. He managed to scrape together 175 untrained militiamen, without a single uniform or a single piece of artillery. In July 1778, he bypassed the British river patrols completely. He marched his men 120 miles overland through trackless territory and captured the British outpost of Kaskaskia without firing a shot. Knowing the local French inhabitants feared the Americans, Clark let them panic for a few hours. Then he calmly informed them that France and the United States had just signed a military alliance. Their loyalty flipped immediately. Clark proved that when you lack men and artillery, weaponizing perception can capture territory just as effectively. The British quickly retaliated. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton marched a massive force south and recaptured Fort Sackville at Vincennes. But Hamilton made a fatal strategic error. Assuming the flooded Wabash River Valley was entirely impassable during the winter months, he sent his native allies home and settled into the fort to wait for spring. Clark realized that if he waited for the thaw, Hamilton would gather his full force and wipe out the Kentucky frontier. He had to attack immediately. He forced his men on a grueling 200-mile march through freezing water. When they ran out of food and the men faltered, Clark kept them moving forward through sheer force of personality, personally breaking the surface ice with his bare hands. This schematic of the terrain outside Vincennes reveals Clark's visual bluff. He marched his exhausted survivors in a continuous loop behind a small hill, unfurling dozens of banners to project the illusion of a massive 600-man army. Zooming in on the fort, Clark used the surrounding structures as cover. His frontier marksmen poured fire directly through the fort's gun ports, pinning down the British soldiers and preventing them from manning their own cannons. Completely stunned by the impossible attack and unable to mount a defense, Hamilton agreed to an unconditional surrender. Clark secured a heavily fortified British position without losing a single soldier. He had paralyzed a superior force through a combination of psychological pressure and physical grit. Because Clark physically occupied the territory and held the forts, the British were entirely locked out of the Illinois country for the rest of the war. When diplomats sat down to negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Clark's military control forced Britain to cede the entire region to the United States. This map demonstrates the immense scale of that transfer. Clark's victory secured the land that would eventually form Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, effectively doubling the size of the original nation. He had achieved his ultimate goal. The British threat to the frontier was over, and the United States now held a physical claim to the land reaching all the way to the Mississippi. But wars require capital. To keep his men fed and moving, Clark had personally financed the expedition by borrowing heavily against his own name. Virginia refused to fully reimburse him. They trapped his debt in endless legislative committees for years, leaving his creditors to slowly seize his land and property. Clark spent his final years in near obscurity. After suffering a severe stroke, he collapsed into a fireplace, burning his right leg so badly it had to be amputated. Decades after his victories, the government finally offered the bedridden man a small annual pension and a decorative ceremonial sword. The man whose sheer physical courage secured the western expansion of the United States died in massive debt, abandoned by the country he helped build. In 1777, the American frontier was bleeding. Settlers called it the Year of the Bloody Sevens. Across Kentucky, isolated cabins were burning to the ground as deadly raids forced families to sleep with loaded rifles. The standard military response was entirely defensive. The doctrine on the frontier was simple: build a crude wooden stockade, pull your people inside, and pray you survive until winter. But this map of the frontier reveals why defense was failing. British commanders in the Illinois country used remote outposts to supply Native American raids with muskets. Look at the scale of the geography. Hundreds of miles of untamed wilderness separated these British strongholds from colonial armies in the east, keeping them insulated from retaliation. Hiding behind wooden walls while the enemy enjoyed endless supplies was a slow death sentence. To stop the raids, the Americans needed a radically different approach. A 26-year-old surveyor named George Rogers Clark offered one. He proposed leaving the Kentucky settlements behind, crossing into British territory, and taking their supply forts directly. To Orthodox generals, this sounded like a suicide mission. Clark wanted to drag an expedition through trackless forests with no reliable supply lines, no communication, and zero chance of rescue. When he finally gathered his volunteers, he didn't have an army. He had roughly 170 ununiformed militiamen carrying their own rifles, entirely cut off from the Continental Army's resources. Clark lacked the massive manpower. He had almost no money and zero artillery for the campaign. If he was going to win, he had to fight a completely asymmetric war. Instead of hauling heavy wagons down predictable river routes, Clark marched his men 120 miles overland. They navigated by compass through the humid summer wilderness to ensure the British had no idea they were coming. They reached the British-controlled village of Kaskaskia just after midnight on July 4, 1778. Splitting into small groups, they slipped through the dark streets, secured the local fort, and captured the sleeping commander without firing a single musket. Physical control of the fort was only half the problem. Kaskaskia's French Catholic residents expected the Americans to act like violent barbarians described in British propaganda. Clark neutralized that fear by announcing a new alliance between France and the United States, promising to protect their property and their right to worship. Within days, those same residents were volunteering supplies for his next move. He secured his first major victory by doing the exact opposite of what the enemy expected. Instead of a loud, slow siege, he used speed, silence, and clever diplomacy. The British responded quickly. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton marched south and reclaimed Fort Sackville at Vincennes. Confident that the brutal winter weather made military operations impossible, Hamilton sent many of his men home and settled in to wait for spring. Clark knew waiting for spring meant facing a reinforced British army and its Native American allies. His only window of opportunity was the dead of winter, a season where flooded rivers and freezing temperatures acted as a natural barrier that Hamilton assumed no army could cross. In February 1779, Clark led his men into the frozen wilderness. For roughly 180 miles, they endured heavy rains and waded through vast flooded prairies, with the freezing water often reaching their chests. When exhaustion and starvation threatened to break the column, Clark refused to let them stop. He smeared black gunpowder across his face like war paint, let out a shout, and plunged directly into the ice-covered floodwaters, forcing his shivering men to follow. Instead of letting the brutal environment defeat him, Clark weaponized it. The flooded, deadly route was so impassable that it served as the ultimate cloak of surprise. When the 170 survivors finally staggered out of the floodwaters near Vincennes, they were starving, soaked, and facing a fortified British position without a single piece of siege artillery. So Clark instead manufactured his own strength. He ordered his men to march in continuous loops behind a small hill, carrying dozens of distinct flags, creating the illusion that a massive, fresh American army had just arrived. When the shooting started, Clark leaned on his only real advantage, elite frontier marksmanship. His riflemen took cover and fired with such lethal accuracy that they sniped British troops directly through the fort's narrow cannon ports, neutralizing Hamilton's heavy defenses. The surrender of Fort Sackville was a victory of psychological pressure and superior marksmanship. Clark had successfully leveraged a handful of flags and 170 riflemen to break the will of a better fortified commander. The ripples of that winter campaign eventually reached Paris. During the 1783 peace negotiations, Clark's physical occupation of the western forts provided American diplomats with undeniable leverage. Britain ceded the entire Northwest Territory, a region that would eventually form 5 new states and double the landmass of the original 13 colonies. Yet the architect of this geopolitical triumph was left with nothing. Clark had borrowed heavily against his own name to keep his men fed and armed. When the war ended, the government stonewalled his receipts and left him drowning in debt. His final years were spent in quiet obscurity. Plagued by creditors, he suffered a series of debilitating strokes, eventually losing his leg to a terrible fireplace accident in a small, remote cabin. He died essentially forgotten by the nation he helped build. But the map of America stretches as far as it does today because a young surveyor and a handful of starving men were willing to wager everything against a freezing wilderness. February 1779. In the middle of the Illinois wilderness, a column of 170 starving militiamen is slogging through freezing floodwaters that reach past their waists. Leading this column is George Rogers Clark, a 26-year-old surveyor from Virginia. Every morning, he is the first man to break the ice and step into the water. This desperate, half-drowned militia is marching toward a strategic victory that will ultimately double the size of the United States. To see why a rogue commander convinced his men to attempt a seemingly suicidal winter march, we have to look at the failing military strategy that forced their hand. By 1777, the American Revolution is raging. General George Washington has the Continental Army tied up fighting in the east, leaving the western frontier vulnerable. British commanders based in Canada saw this vacuum. Operating from a network of secure forts in the Illinois country, they supplied weapons and coordinated Native American raids directly into isolated Kentucky settlements. The violence was so relentless that settlers called 1777 the Year of the Bloody Sevens. Small frontier communities responded by hiding behind wooden stockades, hoping to survive one more season. Clark studied these attacks and realized passive defense was a mathematical impossibility. Without a conventional army to protect the farms, the settlements would eventually starve or be overrun. Instead of defending Kentucky, Clark proposed taking the war straight to the British forts. He secured secret authorization to raise volunteers, ultimately gathering just 175 untrained men with no artillery and zero reliable supply lines. All traditional metrics of 18th century warfare guaranteed this force would be wiped out. Clark knew he had to invent a radically asymmetrical approach to survive. His first tactic was prioritizing speed over mass. Clark organized a light, hypermobile strike force, abandoning the heavy wagons and slow supply trains that usually bogged down colonial armies. He also refused to take the easy path. Instead of following the easily monitored river routes to the British outpost at Kaskaskia, he led his men on a brutal 120-mile overland march through trackless wilderness in the dead of summer. The exhaustion paid off. Clark's men arrived undetected, capturing the fort in the dark without firing a single shot. But holding the region required more than 175 men. Clark deployed his second tactic, geopolitical leverage. He gathered the terrified French-speaking civilians and informed them that France and the United States had just signed an alliance. Psychologically flipping the local population from British subjects into American allies instantly solved his lack of supplies. Local militia joined his ranks, and merchants extended credit to feed his army. The momentum didn't last. By December 1778, British commander Henry Hamilton marched south with a massive force and recaptured the vital American-held outpost of Vincennes. Then, Hamilton made a fatal assumption based on conventional military doctrine. The local rivers had overflowed, turning the region around Vincennes into miles of standing water. Assuming no army could cross the flooded plains, Hamilton sent most of his forces home for the winter. Clark saw this impassable terrain as his only window for total strategic surprise. He decided to weaponize the floodwaters. He forced his men on a nearly 200-mile march through freezing swamps. When they began to falter from starvation and hypothermia, Clark held them together through sheer force of personality, smearing gunpowder across his face and plunging into the ice first. By choosing a route that conventional doctrine deemed impossible, Clark turned the lethal frontier geography into his greatest tactical advantage. Arriving at Vincennes, Clark deployed psychological warfare. He unfurled dozens of company banners, marching his exhausted men back and forth behind a small ridge to create the optical illusion of a 600-man army. Next, he utilized the fort's own structural flaws. As shown in this illustration, Fort Sackville was surrounded by buildings and fences. Clark's frontier marksmen used that cover to fire their long rifles with lethal precision directly into the fort's defenses. This accuracy met every redcoat and showed his face. The British couldn't even open their gun ports to return fire, rendering their cannons useless and forcing Hamilton to surrender unconditionally. A vastly inferior force broke a fortified British stronghold without a conventional siege, relying entirely on illusion, speed, and precision. This map illustrates the massive geopolitical outcome of that victory. Because Clark physically occupied the region, American diplomats had the leverage to claim the Northwest Territory during the 1783 Treaty of Paris. Yet the state of Virginia abandoned him. The government refused to reimburse the enormous personal debts Clark had taken on to feed and arm his men during the campaign. The brilliant young commander lost his land to creditors. He suffered severe strokes, had his leg amputated after falling into a fireplace, and lived out his final years bankrupt and in near obscurity. A 26-year-old surveyor redrew the American map by recognizing that when the established rules of war guarantee defeat, the only way to win is to break them.
February 1779. 170 starving men stand at the edge of a flooded, 4-mile-wide plain of freezing water. Behind them is a frozen wilderness. In front of them, an impossible crossing. Their commander, a 26-year-old Virginian named George Rogers Clark, doesn't give a speech. He smears black gunpowder across his face, lets out a yell, and breaks the ice with his own hands, wading straight into the chest-deep water. He leaves his men no choice but to follow. To understand why these men are marching into an icy swamp, we have to look back east. The American Revolution is raging, but out here on the frontier, settlers call this the Year of the Bloody Sevens. British forces at Fort Detroit are paying bounties for American scalps, coordinating devastating raids on isolated cabins from distant, heavily armed forts. Building taller stockade walls to defend the settlements was a losing mathematical equation. The only way to stop the raids was to cut off the supply lines by attacking those distant British forts, and Clark decided to do it, even though he had no actual army to command. He managed to recruit exactly 175 men. They were untrained militia, they had no standard uniforms, and had no artillery. This was the force tasked with taking on the British Empire in the West. Yet their first target fell immediately. When Clark arrived at the village of Kaskaskia, he used a simple piece of news instead of bullets. He informed the locals that the French and the United States had just signed an official alliance. The French-speaking civilians instantly dropped any loyalty to the British and swore allegiance to Clark without a single shot fired. The British response was massive. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton marched south with roughly 600 men and seized Fort Sackville at Vincennes. But because winter had flooded the region, Hamilton decided to settle into the fort and wait for spring to hunt down Clark's tiny militia. Clark was trapped. If he waited for the ground to thaw, Hamilton would easily crush his men. The only logical move left was to do the one thing the British commander had ruled out as physically impossible. The standard river routes leading to Vincennes were heavily monitored by the British, so Clark took his men completely off the map, ordering a 200-mile march overland through a region so saturated with floodwaters that it was literally called the Drowned Country. The march rapidly degraded into a survival situation. It rained almost daily. They lost their pack horses, their food ran out, and for weeks the men slogged through miles of standing, freezing water that offered no dry ground to sleep on. Clark kept the column moving through pure psychological force. He cracked jokes, forced the men to sing, organized racing contests through the swamps, and made sure he was the very first man into the freezing water every single morning. It worked. By mid-February, the frozen, half-drowned militia arrived on the outskirts of Vincennes undetected. The British hadn't even posted lookouts facing the flooded plains. Using a 4-mile-wide swamp as a flanking route was a brilliant maneuver, but it only delivered them to the starting line. Now 170 starved frontiersmen had to capture an entrenched, heavily defended British fort. Clark knew he couldn't win a direct assault, so he created a theatrical illusion. He ordered his men to unfurl dozens of flags and march back and forth in overlapping patterns behind a small series of hills. From the townspeople's perspective, this continuous stream of banners looked like a massive army. Convinced of victory, no one warned the British. Under the cover of darkness, Clark's frontier riflemen crept into the town. They used the civilian houses and wooden fences surrounding Fort Sackville to get within striking distance of the walls. Then they opened fire. These Kentucky hunters could hit a keyhole at 100 yards. They aimed with such precision that every time a British soldier tried to open a gun port, a rifle ball met him. The garrison was entirely pinned down by small arms fire. Stunned, taking casualties, and cut off from reinforcements, Governor Hamilton walked out of Fort Sackville the next morning and surrendered his entire command to a 26-year-old with a fraction of his numbers. A handful of starving militiamen had dismantled a superior imperial force entirely through psychological manipulation, environmental endurance, and hyper-precise marksmanship. The diplomatic results of that morning extended far beyond the frontier. Look at this document. This is the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Revolutionary War. Because Clark's men were physically occupying those western forts, American diplomats had the leverage to force the British to cede the entire region. Here in this map, you can see the scale of what they won. That massive green expanse is the Northwest Territory. Capturing it effectively doubled the size of the original 13 colonies, securing the modern states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. But there was a hidden cost to this campaign. To keep his men armed, fed, and moving through the ice, Clark had financed the entire expedition out of his own pocket, borrowing heavily from friends and merchants. His insane winter gamble had bought the United States half a continent, but as the war ended, Clark was the one left holding the bill. The state of Virginia passed his debt from committee to committee, never fully reimbursing him. Creditors came after his personal property. He lost his land, and his reputation slowly deteriorated amid rumors of heavy drinking. He slipped into poverty and near obscurity. Later in life, he suffered a severe stroke, fell into a fireplace, and burned his leg so badly it had to be amputated. In 1812, the government finally granted him an annual pension and sent him a ceremonial sword. He was bedridden, decades past his prime, and the gesture arrived 30 years too late to save him from ruin. Is a brutal contrast to the man standing at the edge of the drowned country, a 26-year-old commander with gunpowder on his face, looking into a freezing swamp and deciding to go first. George Rogers Clark ignored conventional warfare to secure the American West, but his life remains a harsh reminder of the physical and financial tolls extracted from the individuals who actually build nations.
February 1779. In the middle of the Illinois wilderness, a 26-year-old Virginian stands at the edge of a flooded plain. He spends a moment smearing black powder across his face like war paint, then leads his men directly into the freezing, waist-deep water. The 170 men following him have been marching for 2 weeks without proper food, breaking through sheets of ice with their bare hands. They are heading toward a British fort they are technically too small to capture, on a mission that would eventually double the size of the United States. The man leading the march was George Rogers Clark. While his campaign secured one of the largest territorial gains in American history, the cost of the victory would leave him in a cycle of debt and obscurity for the rest of his life. By 1777, the western frontier was a landscape of burning cabins. While the main Continental Army fought the British in the east, Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton was operating out of Detroit, funding raids that left isolated Kentucky settlements in a state of constant siege. Clark realized that staying behind stockade walls would only lead to a slow defeat. He traveled to Virginia to meet with Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, proposing a secret strike to capture the British outposts at Kaskaskia and Vincennes. Virginia authorized the expedition, but provided almost no actual funding. To recruit, feed, and arm a militia of 170 men, Clark had to sign for the supplies himself, borrowing from friends and using his own name to guarantee the state's debts. By the time he pushed his boats into the Ohio River, Clark was not only the commander of the expedition, he was its primary financial backer. The campaign began with a series of diplomatic successes. Clark took the village of Kaskaskia without firing a single shot, then used news of the new French-American alliance to convince the local French-speaking population to switch their allegiance to America. But the British responded quickly. Henry Hamilton marched south from Detroit and recaptured Fort Sackville at Vincennes, effectively cutting off Clark's momentum. This map shows why Hamilton felt safe. The Wabash and Embarrass rivers had overflowed their banks, turning Vincennes into a shallow lake. Assuming the terrain impassable, Hamilton sent his garrison home. Clark decided to do the impossible, leading his men on a 200-mile march directly through the flooded plains in the dead of February. The conditions were brutal. The men spent days wading through chest-high water, sleeping on small patches of frozen ground with empty stomachs. On the final morning, they woke up with their clothes frozen to their bodies. Clark waded in first, using his fists to break the ice for the men behind him. When they finally reached the outskirts of Vincennes, Clark faced a problem. He had 170 exhausted men and no artillery. Hamilton held a fortified position with cannons and a fresh garrison. Clark used terrain to his advantage. He ordered his men to unfurl every flag they carried and march back and forth behind a series of small hills on the edge of town. By disappearing and reappearing in patterns, they created the impression of a much larger force arriving to reinforce the siege. As his men took positions behind buildings, Kentucky marksmen began firing into the fort's gun ports. Their accuracy was so high that the British soldiers could not open the ports to aim their cannons without being hit by rifle balls. Hamilton, convinced he was facing a massive army and realizing his own militia wouldn't fight, surrendered Fort Sackville unconditionally on February 25th. Clark had taken one of the most important British strongholds in the West through physical endurance and the simple act of making 170 men look like 600. When the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, Clark's presence in the Illinois country became a decisive factor. Because his militia physically held the forts, American diplomats like Benjamin Franklin had the leverage to claim the entire region at the negotiating table. This map shows the result. The
The Treaty of Paris cedes the entire Northwest Territory to the United States, land that would eventually become the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. With the British forts removed, the frontier became a corridor for expansion. Settlements like Louisville, which Clark had founded as a small supply base, grew into major hubs for the new nation. The control Clark established on the ground ensured that the new nation's borders reached the Mississippi River, rather than stopping at the Appalachian Mountains. But as the territory grew, Clark's own fortune collapsed. The state of Virginia refused to reimburse him for the debts he had signed for during the campaign, leaving him legally responsible for the costs of the entire operation. Creditors hounded him for the rest of his life, seizing his property and his land. He suffered a stroke at 56 and fell into a fireplace, resulting in a burn that led to the amputation of his leg. He spent his final years bedridden and reliant on his family, living in the very region he had conquered, while the nation around him grew wealthy from the land he secured. The stone memorial in Vincennes stands on the site where the fort once was. It serves as a reminder of the individuals who pay the personal cost of expansion, men who secure the land only to have no place in the world they helped build.